on tight.
What if I told you that the greatest sea voyage in history, the first circumnavigation of the globe, ended not in triumph, but in a desperate struggle for survival? There is a hidden truth about what happened aboard the Victoria in the final months of its journey. We know the names of Ferdinand Magellan and Juan Sebastian Elcano, but we rarely talk about the sacrifices the survivors had to make to return home. These are decisions that blur the line between heroism and desperation, and the price paid to complete the circle around the globe. Watch this video to the end to find out how the crew ate their own ship to survive, and what single most precious resource they lost along the way without even noticing. I will reveal to you a secret that is often overlooked when talking about this expedition. Initially, it was not a journey for the sake of circumnavigating the globe. In August 1519, when 5 ships under the command of the Portuguese Fernão Magalhães left the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, they had a specific commercial and strategic objective. The Spanish crown financed this risky mission with one goal in mind: to find a western route to the Moluccas, the legendary Spice Islands. This route would allow Spain to challenge Portugal's monopoly on fabulously expensive cloves and nutmeg without violating the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the two powers. Magellan himself was a man of iron will, an experienced navigator, but also a controversial figure. His fleet consisted of 5 carracks, the flagship Trinidad, as well as the San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. There were about 270 people on board, a truly international crew. Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, French, and Germans set off into the unknown, attracted by promises of wealth and glory, but many of them did not trust their Portuguese commander. The first months of the voyage revealed all the internal contradictions. The crossing of the Atlantic was relatively calm, but as soon as the fleet began to explore the rugged coast of South America in search of the mythical strait, tensions rose. Endless storms, cold weather, and a shortage of supplies led to an open mutiny in San Julian Bay in the spring of 1520. The captains of 3 of the 5 ships turned against Magellan, considering his mission suicidal. Magellan suppressed the mutiny with exceptional determination. One of the captains was executed, another was left on a deserted shore, along with a priest who had supported the mutiny. This show of force temporarily restored discipline, but it also sowed the seeds of fear and hatred. The expedition had already paid a high price before it made its main discovery. The ship Santiago was lost during reconnaissance, crashing into rocks. In October 1520, after an exhausting search, Magellan finally found the strait that now bears his name. It was a triumph of his navigational genius and stubbornness. But even here, a blow awaited him. The ship San Antonio, carrying a significant portion of the supplies, deserted and turned back to Spain, later accusing Magellan of all mortal sins. The remaining 3 ships entered the unknown ocean, which Magellan named the Pacific. This passage cost the expedition everything. It took 38 days of a chilling maze of fjords to get through it. The crew was exhausted and supplies were running low. They were entering the largest body of water on the planet with no maps and no idea of its true size. The grand plan was turning into the greatest test of endurance, and this was only the beginning. We are very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think of Magellan's methods? Was such determination justified by the great goal? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the secret that changed the course of the entire expedition? Crossing the Pacific Ocean became a test that even Magellan could not have foreseen. He expected to find Asia in a few days or weeks, but instead the ships sailed for 3 months and 20 days without seeing land, except for a couple of uninhabited atolls. Famine set in on board, and the crew faced the first of many horrors of survival. Scurvy, the terrible disease of sailors, began to claim lives one by one. The crew grew weaker, and hope faded with each passing day. Finally, in March of 1521, the exhausted sailors reached the islands they named the Islands of St. Lazarus, later known as the Philippines. For the crew, it was a salvation. Fresh water, fruit, meat. It seemed that the worst was behind them. Magellan, using his Malay slave and interpreter, Enrique, established contact with local chiefs. He saw this not only as an opportunity to replenish supplies, but also as a chance to spread the influence of the Spanish crown and Christianity. This is where the admiral's fatal flaw came into play. Having achieved his goal, he did not stop. He got involved in a civil conflict, deciding to demonstrate the power of Spanish weapons to one of the local chiefs on the island of Mactan named Lapu-Lapu. Magellan was confident that his handful of soldiers in armor, armed with arquebuses, would easily disperse the natives. It was a fatal mistake, dictated by arrogance and underestimation of the enemy. On April 27, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan died in the coastal waters off the island of Mactan. The attack was poorly planned, the ships were unable to get close due to the reefs, and their artillery was useless. Magellan's soldiers were attacked by superior forces of warriors. The admiral fought to the last but was surrounded and killed. His death came as a shock to the expedition. They had lost not just their commander, but the driving force behind the entire enterprise. Magellan's death destroyed the fragile alliance with the locals. The chief of the island of Cebu, who had previously converted to Christianity and sworn allegiance to Spain, set a trap. During a feast, ostensibly held to exchange gifts, about 30 members of the expedition, including many of their remaining officers, were treacherously killed. The expedition was decapitated, demoralized, and on the verge of complete destruction, thousands of miles from home. Now the survivors were faced not with the task of finding the Spice Islands, but with the simple and terrifying goal of survival. The crew had been reduced so much that there were not enough people to man the 3 ships. They were forced to make a difficult decision. On the island of Bohol, they burned the most dilapidated of the remaining ships, the Concepcion. All the surviving crew and supplies were divided between the Trinidad and the Victoria. Command of the fleet passed to Juan Sebastian Elcano, a former mutineer whose life Magellan had once saved. Do you think Magellan's death was a natural consequence of his character? Are you ready for the shocking truth about how a Basque sailor became a leader? Juan Sebastian Elcano was not the obvious choice for the role of savior. He was one of those who participated in the mutiny in San Julian Bay. However, in the chaos that followed Magellan's death and the massacre at Cebu, old scores were forgotten. Elcano, an experienced navigator and captain of the Victoria, was the man who could take responsibility for the remnants of the fleet. His pragmatism and seafaring experience were now valued above former loyalties. He faced an almost impossible task. 2 ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria, were in terrible condition. The crew was exhausted by disease and constant skirmishes. They had not yet reached their main destination, the Moluccas, but had already lost more than half their men and 3 of their 5 ships. Elcano and his companions spent the next few months wandering among the islands of Southeast Asia, engaging in piracy and desperately searching for guides. This period of the expedition is often overlooked, but it was crucial. It was here that a new command structure was formed. Elcano and his men finally reached the Moluccas, specifically the island of Tidore, in November 1521. Magellan's goal had been achieved, but only after his death. The Spaniards were able to load the holds of the Victoria and Trinidad with precious cloves. This cargo was so valuable that even one returning ship could completely recoup all the costs of the expedition. But then a new problem arose: how to return to Spain. The return journey across the Pacific Ocean was considered too dangerous and too long. In addition, the flagship Trinidad had sprung a serious leak and needed major repairs. A decision was made that once again divided their fates. The Trinidad was to remain for repairs and then attempt to cross the Pacific Ocean and reach the Spanish colonies in Panama. This plan was doomed to failure. The ship would later be captured by the Portuguese, and almost none of its crew would return to Europe. Juan Sebastian Elcano and his Victoria chose a different, equally insane route. They decided to sail west. This meant crossing the Indian Ocean and circumnavigating Africa, moving through waters that were completely controlled by their main enemies, the Portuguese. It was a direct challenge to the Portuguese crown. Elcano was forced to sail his only ship, overloaded with spices and worn out, through hostile territory, without the right to make a single stop at any port. This unique choice to sail westward home was the decision that ultimately led to the first circumnavigation of the globe in history. It was not planned initially. It was a desperate decision made for the sake of survival. Elcano understood that any other route meant certain death. He led his men on their last, longest, and most terrifying voyage, where they faced not storms, but a slow and silent horror. If you are interested in this story of survival, please like this video. What I am about to show you was forbidden by order of the king. After the Victoria left the Moluccas on December 21st, 1521, there were only 47 Europeans and 13 natives on board. The ship was loaded to capacity, about 26 tons of cloves and nutmeg. This cargo was their only hope for forgiveness and wealth, but it also made the ship slow and unwieldy. Elcano set a course westward into the Indian Ocean and ordered the ship to stay as far south as possible to avoid encountering Portuguese patrols. This stage of the journey became a real race for survival, but the enemy was not only the ocean. The main adversary was Portugal. According to the Treaty of Tordesillas, all seas east of a certain meridian belonged to Lisbon. Elcano deliberately steered the Spanish ship through the heart of the Portuguese Empire. Any encounter with a Portuguese vessel would mean arrest, loss of the ship and cargo, and most likely execution for the entire crew. Because of this, the Victoria could not call at ports to replenish supplies. Mozambique, India, the coast of Africa. All these lands were under enemy control. Elcano was forced to sail his ship on the open ocean, relying only on the meager supplies they had taken on Tidore. The plan was to reach Spain without a single stop. It was a plan unprecedented in its audacity and risk. The voyage across the Indian Ocean took months. At first, the weather was favorable, but then storms began. The ship, which had not been properly repaired for 2 years, began to leak. The pumps worked around the clock, and the crew was at the end of their strength. But the worst was yet to come when they began to round the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. This part of the journey, notorious for its roaring 40s latitudes, became a living hell for them. For several weeks, the Victoria battled giant waves and headwinds. The ship was nearly capsized, and one of the masts was broken. The crew was in despair. Many demanded to turn back to Mozambique and surrender to the Portuguese, preferring captivity to certain death in the ocean. But Elcano showed the same iron will as Magellan. He insisted on his own way, and in the end they managed to round the Cape. But at what cost? By the time the Victoria entered the Atlantic Ocean in May 1522, it was a ghost ship. The long voyage without fresh food had led to disaster. Scurvy, which had already plagued the crew in the Pacific Ocean, returned with a vengeance. This disease, caused by a complete lack of vitamin C, was the bane of all long voyages of that era. Its effects were terrible and inevitable. Unable to replenish their supplies, the crew began to weaken and fall ill. The expedition's chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, who was one of the few survivors, left behind gruesome accounts of the journey. He described how the crew members lost their strength, could not stand on their feet, and their bodies were covered with ulcers. Morale was completely broken. Every day, people saw their comrades die in agony. It became almost impossible to control the ship. Of the 47 people who left the Moluccas, barely half remained at this point. There was no one to stand at the helm, manage the sails, or pump water out of the hold. The Victoria drifted in the Atlantic, and each new day brought only new losses. Elcano understood that if he did not take immediate action, they would all perish here, a few weeks' journey from home. Food supplies were completely exhausted. The rice and water they had brought with them had spoiled. The crew switched to starvation rations, which were getting smaller and smaller. There was nothing left on the ship that was edible in the usual sense of the word. And it was at this moment of despair that Juan Sebastian Elcano and his men were forced to make the darkest and most unthinkable decision of their 3-year odyssey. This decision was not heroic. It was dictated by a primitive instinct for survival. They had exhausted all conceivable resources. Ahead of them lay only a slow death from starvation or disease. In order to survive, they had to look at their own ship, the only home they had, not as a vessel, but as their last source of sustenance. Want to know the secret that cost people their lives? When there was not a grain of rice or a drop of fresh water left on the Victoria, the crew faced a choice: die or eat what was not meant to be eaten. They began to eat their own ship. Antonio Pigafetta dispassionately recorded this horror in his diary. He wrote that they were forced to eat the ox hide that had been wrapped around the yards and parts of the mast to protect them from chafing. This leather was hard as rock, dried by the sun and soaked in salt water. To make it even remotely edible, the sailors cut off pieces and soaked them in seawater for several days to soften them. Then they boiled the skin for a long time or simply threw it on hot coals to char it. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was an extreme act of desperation, an attempt to trick a stomach that was gnawing with hunger. But even that was not enough. Pigafetta mentions that they ate sawdust. This probably refers to sawdust that had accumulated in the hold or that remained after repairs to the ship. This wood dust mixed with the last drops of rotten, foul-smelling water was their only food. The water was infested with maggots and had a disgusting smell, but even it was worth its weight in gold. Some sources mention that the crew hunted rodents that lived on the ship. In normal times, these creatures were despised, but in conditions of total starvation, they became valuable prey. They were paid huge sums of money for them, if anyone still had the strength to catch them. It was survival at the most primitive level, where all the norms of civilization were discarded for the sake of another day of life. These absurd methods saved those who could still fight. Eating leather fittings and sawdust allowed them to hold out for the few weeks that separated them from land. But the price was incredibly high. By the time the Victoria approached the coast of Africa, there were as many weakened people on board as there were those who had already left this world. And what do you think? Can these people be condemned for their choice? In July 1522, after nearly 7 months of continuous sailing from Tidore, the Victoria was on the verge of disaster. Only 22 people remained on board, barely alive from starvation and scurvy. Elcano realized that they would not make it to Spain. He was forced to break his own orders and risk everything by stopping at the Cape Verde Islands, which were Portuguese territory. It was a desperate move, a gamble. Elcano devised a cunning plan. He dropped anchor at one of the islands and sent a boat ashore. The remaining sailors had to lie. They claimed that their ship was part of the Spanish fleet returning from America, and that during a terrible storm, their mast had broken and they had run out of supplies. Under no circumstances were they to mention Magellan, the Moluccas, or their journey across the Indian Ocean. At first, the deception worked. The Portuguese, moved by the sailors' plight, sold them the necessary supplies and fresh water. The boat made 2 trips, delivering life-saving provisions to the Victoria. It was their first normal meal in many months. It seemed that luck had finally smiled on them. But on the 3rd day, when the boat with 13 sailors set off for the shore for the last batch of rice, the deception was revealed. It is not known exactly what gave them away. According to one version, one of the sailors tried to pay for the supplies with a few pinches of cloves, a spice that could only have come from the east in that part of the world. According to another version, Portuguese officials simply suspected something was wrong after comparing the dates and the condition of the ship. Whatever the case, all 13 men who went ashore were immediately arrested. For Elcano, this was a terrible blow. He saw his men being captured, but could do nothing to help them. He had only 18 men left on board the Victoria, including himself, and most of them were too weak to even raise the anchor. Engaging in battle with the Portuguese garrison would have been suicide. He had no choice. Elcano ordered the anchor rope to be cut and all possible sails to be hoisted. The Victoria fled, leaving 13 of its comrades in Portuguese captivity. Now there were only 18 men left on board the Victoria. These were the ones who had gone through all the circles of hell: mutinies, storms, hunger, and disease. They were the shadow of the 270 adventurers who had left Spain 3 years ago. The loss of 13 comrades in the Cape Verde Islands, just when salvation was so close, was the final tragedy of this voyage. But now they had water and a little food, and they were determined to reach home. The last leg of the journey from the African coast to Spain was agonizingly long. 18 exhausted men steered a broken, battered ship that was barely staying afloat. They were ghosts returning from another world. And when, on September 6, 1522, the Victoria finally entered the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, the very port from which they had departed, the locals did not immediately recognize them. The ship's appearance had the effect of a bombshell. They had been presumed dead for over a year. On board was Antonio Pigafetta, who, despite his exhaustion, continued to keep his logbook. And it was he who made the last, most mystical discovery of this expedition. Comparing his notes with the port calendar, Pigafetta realized that they had lost a whole day. According to their calculations, it was Wednesday, September 5th, but in Spain it was already Friday, September 7th. The date of return was September 6th, 1522. Pigafetta arrived at the port on the 6th, but discovered the discrepancy on the 7th when he compared his logbook with the date on land. This phenomenon, which today seems to us to be an obvious consequence of crossing the dateline, was a real shock to the people of the 16th century. They, devout Catholics, had missed a day of fasting and feasting. This became the first practical, human proof that the Earth was indeed round. By circumnavigating it from west to east, they gained a day on the sun. This scientific discovery was no less important than the fact of circumnavigation itself. When the Victoria sailed up the river to Seville, it was greeted by a crowd. 18 survivors, looking more like skeletons, came ashore in tattered clothes, holding candles in their hands. They walked barefoot to the church of Santa Maria de la Victoria to give thanks for their miraculous rescue. Their odyssey, which had lasted 3 years and 20 days, was over. The first circumnavigation of the globe in human history was complete, but its price was unimaginable. Of the 5 ships that set sail, only 1 returned. Of the approximately 270 men who set out on the voyage, only 18 returned to Seville on the Victoria. Later, several more men from the Trinidad crew and the 13 who had been captured in the Cape Verde Islands managed to return to Spain, but the total number of survivors was negligible. From a financial point of view, the expedition, despite the losses, was incredibly successful. The cargo of cloves that the Victoria brought back in its holds was sold at such a profit that it more than covered all the costs of organizing the 5 ships. The investors made a profit, and Spain gained invaluable knowledge about sea routes and confirmation of its claims to the Spice Islands. Elcano and his men were rewarded by the king. Juan Sebastián Elcano received a personal coat of arms depicting the globe with the motto, "Primus circumdediste me," "You were the first to circumnavigate me." He became a national hero, the man who completed what Magellan had begun. But his fame was short-lived. He set sail again for the Spice Islands and disappeared in the Pacific Ocean, never returning to his homeland. His fate, like that of Magellan, remained in those waters. Antonio Pigafetta, thanks to whom we know the details of this journey, published his diary. His work became an invaluable source of information, not only about the voyage itself, but also about the geography, peoples, and languages they encountered. It was a real scientific breakthrough that changed Europeans' view of the world. Maps were redrawn and the size of the planet was refined. However, behind these triumphs lay human tragedies. For the indigenous peoples encountered by the expedition, this contact often marked the beginning of the end. The arrival of Europeans in the Philippines and the Moluccas marked the beginning of centuries of colonization, conflict, and exploitation. What was an era of great discoveries for Europe was an era of great losses for many other peoples. The story of Juan Sebastián Elcano and the Victoria is not just a tale of geographical discovery. It is a harsh parable about human endurance, ambition, and the price one must pay to be the first. The Magellan-Elcano expedition proved two things that changed the world forever. First, that the Earth is a sphere, and second, that all the oceans on it are connected into a single world ocean. The legacy of this voyage is twofold. On the one hand, it is a triumph of the human spirit, navigational science, and courage. People in small wooden ships crossed 3 oceans, encountered unknown cultures, endured hunger, disease, and mutinies, but they completed their journey. They did what had been considered impossible before them and ushered in the era of globalization. On the other hand, it is a story of incredible hardship. The story of how sailors ate bark from the masts and sawdust became a grim symbol of this journey. It shows that behind the facade of great achievements, there are always ordinary people pushed to their limits. The survival of the Victoria was a miracle, but a miracle that cost hundreds of lives. The voyage also revealed ethical dilemmas that remain relevant to this day. Magellan's conflict at Mactan, Elcano's decision to sacrifice 13 comrades at the Green Cape Islands, the deception and violence that sometimes accompanied the expedition, all of this raises difficult questions about morality in extreme conditions. Where is the line between the necessary toughness of a leader and tyranny, between survival and betrayal? The Victoria returned to Spain as a ghost ship, but its return changed the course of history. The 18 men who disembarked in Seville were the first people to prove from their own experience that our world is one. Their 3-year odyssey, which began in pursuit of spices and ended in a desperate struggle for life, will forever remain in the annals as the greatest and most tragic maritime adventure of all time. We see that the first circumnavigation of the globe was not a triumphant parade, but a cruel drama of survival. The story of Juan Sebastián Elcano and his decision to eat parts of his own ship is not just a shocking detail, but the quintessence of the entire expedition. It is a story about how great discoveries are made not thanks to, but in spite of circumstances, and that the price for being the first can be unbearably high. The voyage of the Victoria is a hymn to human stubbornness. It proves that even when all is lost, the commander, the ships, the supplies, and hope, the will to live can make a person do the impossible, cross the ocean, eating sawdust, and return home to tell the world about it. What part of this 3-year odyssey impressed you the most? Elcano's desperate decision to head west, or the fact that the crew lost an entire day? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories about the price of great discoveries.